Welcome everyone now to the second episode of the Textbook Boxing podcast. I didn't do one of these, I'm a little bit late, but I thought it would still be a good thing just to run through some of the fights last week, to give you my thoughts, all that good stuff. As I now will try and do with these, I'll put all the timestamps down below so you can just skip to a more important fight if that's what you want to do. I thought the obvious place to start would be with Canelo v Crawford, with Canelo obviously winning, Crawford obviously winning that unanimous decision. For anyone that watched my pre-fight video, I was pretty sure that Crawford was going to win this. For me, I always saw Canelo having issues with Crawford's foot movement, and the things that Crawford struggles with tends to be people who are active, either with their hands or with their feet. So guys like Madrimov, or I think I recently saw the Sean Porter fight. You know, guys like that will give Crawford something to think about. And so at an older age, I just didn't see Canelo being that guy. And Crawford also being the type of fighter that has historically caused Canelo problems. That's the way I saw it. I saw this as a 8-4, 9-3 kind of fight. And I've seen the fight twice. I've seen it once on my phone with no commentary, and I've seen it once properly on Netflix with all the bells and whistles. And I think broadly the fight did go as I expected. I haven't seen too many post-fights on this. I kind of purposefully don't. But I think the consensus was that this was a little bit of a masterclass by Crawford. And I don't really disagree with that. I think, you know, you're talking about a guy that's moved up effectively 3 weight divisions to take on Canelo and has won clearly. You know, in no world can you take anything away from this guy. But I did see a couple of headlines about people saying that this fight was maybe closer than people were expecting. And on the first watch, when I watched this, I thought Crawford kind of won this 9-3 easily. But then on a rewatch, I was kind of like, okay, it's more like 8-4 with 3 or 4 kind of close rounds in there. And I'm not going to repeat what happened in the fight because I'm sure you've watched plenty of post-fights that kind of go through this. I just kind of think a few points are really interesting. Is this fight reminded me a lot. Canelo looked like the Canelo that fought William Skull a while back. To me, he looked plodding. But to me, it's amazing what the difference a commentary team can make. Because I don't think Canelo looked that different from, as I say, that different from the Skull fight. But everyone kind of gave him that fight easy, and everyone thinks he looked crap in this fight and he's finished. So I just thought that was interesting. And I also think it's interesting. Sometimes when you get a fighter that is coming up like Crawford or who is the underdog, people are often surprised at, they give that fighter more credit because what they're doing isn't quite as expected. And I think you saw that a little bit with Terrance Crawford. I'm not saying he lost by any means. You know, to me, it was an 8-4 max 7-5 kind of fight. But I do think the fact that Canelo was landing a lot of shots to some, mainly his big shots were to the body, whereas Crawford's was to the head. And also that Crawford was doing a little bit of showboating. He had that kind of wry smile, dancing around, whereas Canelo was plodding forwards and looking a bit more frustrated in body language. I'm not saying it's to this extent, but like the Fury Wilder 1 fight, where there's not a huge amount in the rounds, but you've just got one guy that is looking a lot more. They're winning the body language part of the fight. That was the way I saw that. That being said, Crawford was giving Canelo fits by quite often spinning off to his right. Canelo, as I thought, was getting Canelo's not a combination puncher anymore, really. He's a kind of 1-2 big shot to the body, 2 throwaway shots and then a big shot. And that, because they're only one big shot rather than 2s and 3s, Crawford was able to counter those a lot of the time. And there wasn't really a jab from Canelo that I expected, but that I think really hurt him in the fight. For the first 4 rounds, there were a couple of close rounds in there, but you kind of gave most of them to Crawford. Canelo then came on a bit stronger, a bit of urgency, and then Crawford kind of finished strongly, broadly as I expected, to be brutally honest. And there were spots in there where Crawford decided to hold his feet a little bit and exchange with Canelo, and there were times when Canelo would land in those exchanges, but you just got the sense that that Crawford was the one who would decide when those exchanges would happen. And because of that, and the fact that Crawford was the one that was landing with a little bit more regularity with the jab, the problem with Canelo a lot of the time is there's not enough sustained work throughout the round. I'm not expecting him to be, Alexander Usyk and doing all that sort of crap. But just a little bit of a jab rather than relying on pressure and the occasional big shot. So I think is important at the highest level, and that is what this is. So I think that was interesting. I think the way they scored it, I think I had it 116, 112 on a rewatch. There were a few close rounds in there, and I wasn't scoring it as a judge. I was taking notes and watching the fight as I do. But I think that was really interesting. Canelo also in the post-fight didn't exactly seem like he wanted or was gunning for a rematch. And I also, it'd be interesting to see what Terrance Crawford does. I mean, he's kind of cleared everything out, and you would have thought that would be it. There's nothing else really there for him. No big names really, unless I'm missing someone out really obvious at those lower weight. So he's done everything, and so is Canelo, and they can both kind of sail off into the sunset. Check my notes. Yeah, and I think for me, I think you may be a bit surprised when you hear this kind of opinion, but how I kind of perceive the fight. But I think it's really interesting how the expectation of a fight of a fight going in kind of really colours how you watch a fight. To me, none of what Crawford did really surprised me. I expected him to be able to outbox and outmove, and to be honest, outfight Canelo to be honest, a little bit more than he actually did on a rewatch. And I think people often are maybe coming at it from the other side, where they were so surprised at what Crawford did, they maybe see the fight as a little bit clearer than it actually was. To me, a a 7-5, 8-4 is about right. It wasn't the 10-2, 9-3 that maybe some people were thinking. But Jesus Christ, Terrance Crawford, what a fighter. For a long time, I thought he was the best in and around that weight. And he's proved it hands down. What more can you ask for as a guy? The next fight, I will just go over because it was such a big fight over here, was the Paddy Donovan, Lewis Crocker 2 fight. And that fight ended by Lewis Crocker, I think, getting a split decision. And again, like the Terrance Crawford fight, that there's a lot of talking points there. Was it a robbery? To me, I scored it a draw. Lewis Crocker came out fighting a lot more counter-punching style than he normally does, sitting out on the back foot and waiting for Paddy Donovan to come in. When Donovan came in, Crocker would try and hit him with primarily a big left hook. Crocker has this really weird kind of body mechanics where he will quite often throw hooks, kind of Danny Garcia style, almost looking at the floor. And he also his kind of whole shoulder almost seems to sort of dislocate. But you can see there's power in it because of the reaction it got from Donovan. So the fight set out, and I think Donovan was as shocked by Crocker's start as anyone. Very cagey, very not much in it at all. And those first, I think, 3 or 4 rounds, and a lot of these, sorry, apart from the third, obviously, but that first half of the fight, there were a lot of close rounds in there. And I think it's dependent on how you score those rounds is kind of how you saw the whole fight. I think I had maybe 4 or 3 close rounds in there. And I think, to be kind of upfront, I think Paddy Donovan is by far and away the superior fighter, and was a little bit maybe screwed in how boxing is scored, because you had a couple of flash knockdowns in there. No, that first one was a flash knockdown in a round he was winning, and I think the same one in the 5th, I think he was winning that round, but those suddenly become 2 10-8s, and you've got a huge kind of hill to climb. And I won't go through the whole fight here because, as I say, I'm sure you've seen loads of post fights already. But I don't think you can call that a robbery by any means. You have two 10-8s in there, and then Crocker's only got to win 3 of the last 10 in order to get a draw. And if you score a couple of even rounds there, and Donovan wasn't doing loads in those rounds, and I think giving it to Crocker is maybe a little bit harsh on Donovan, but I don't see it as a robbery by any means. I don't think you can. What I would say is that Crocker was walking that very fine line between being cagey and just being inactive. And he kind of went back and forth in the fight. And I think from both fighters, both are good, both are solid, world-ish level fighters. But I was a little bit disappointed that throughout the fight, neither one really made that many adjustments. For Crocker, that would be being a little bit more active, being on the front foot, being a bit more active with the jab. I really like both fighters when they were shooting the backhand to the body. I thought Donovan kind of gave that up a little bit as the fight went on. And I think for Donovan, I don't know too much about him. I haven't seen too much in the past, but strikes me as a really good amateur, and the commentary team said he was. But I do think he looks like a fighter that doesn't really have an inside game. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Josh Taylor. That kind of fast with the feet, smooth, spiteful southpaw. But whereas Josh Taylor would throw that double jab left hand into the body and then sometimes stay in the pocket, Donovan was very much in and out, in and out, in and out. And by doing that, I don't think he showed his... I don't think he evidenced how much better skilled he was and how much more precise his shots are compared to Crocker. I think I would have been a little bit more aggressive from Donovan and get up close. Crocker was really, really reliant on that left hook. And when he missed, he was in a terrible position a lot of the time. And I'm not saying doing it from, round 6 on, from even the first half of the fight, but I just think putting that little bit of pressure on Crocker would have forced him into bad positions and maybe have left a bit of an opening for Donovan. And for Donovan, he might have well have thought, you know what, I'm bossing these rounds, I'm winning them, and so why do I need to take any chances and take any risks? And what I'd say is he was nicking these rounds. The rounds he was winning, he was nicking them. He wasn't really landing anything big. He was landing little pitter-patter shots here and the occasional decent left hand to the body. And I just think a bit more urgency would have really helped Donovan in that fight and maybe made it a bit clearer than even people have said it is. I don't see this as a robbery by any means, and I've always got a little bit of a soft spot for when fighters like Crocker get the win here, because he's probably not the better fighter, but he just had a really good game plan and he boxed to the best of his ability, or at least boxed a lot closer to it than Donovan did. And I think I've always got a really bit of a soft spot for fighters kind of overperforming and beating fighters on skill, on a great game plan, or will, or something like that, and especially being the underdog, I've got a real soft spot for that. But to be super transparent, I scored it, I think that would have been 113. I don't tend to score even rounds, so I think 115, 113 with the 2-point deductions, 113. And I don't think either one of them, I think Donovan's clearly got the higher ceiling than Crocker does. But I don't think he's got much of an inside game yet. We'll see how that goes on with Andy Lee. And I do think he's got a habit of throwing shots and a little bit leaving his chin up in the air. It's not exactly the same, but if I say kind of Amir Khan, Danny Garcia, that kind of, one person comes in, throwing combination is landing, but then the other guy's kind of like timing the shots with their head down, throwing big left hook over the top. It somewhat reminded me of that. But as for Crocker, everyone's talking about the Conor Benn fight now. I think Ben wins that relatively easily. I haven't seen too much of Conor Benn recently, but that's an interesting fight. But I mean, I wouldn't say that's a world level welterweight fight, but so be it. But yeah, I thought it was. These are the sort of fights that's really nice to happen on British soil and not be in Saudi Arabia, because it's these sort of fights that I think set British boxing apart from a lot of foreign boxing, in that we will really show out for these kind of fights, and I think it's what makes British boxing really, really special, at least to me. And now for the to look towards the fight this weekend with his Oscar Collazo versus Jayson Vayson. I'm not familiar on the name really. This for the, I think, WBO minimum weight title. And Oscar Collazo, I've seen a handful of times. And it's one of those guys that to be frank, I'm not that familiar with the lower weight divisions. It's not that I'm not going to watch these guys, below, 126 pounds, because I want to necessarily see knockouts. For me, it's just because being a boxing fan is already a little bit of a lonely sort of fandom. There's not a whole lot of people you can talk about. Paddy Donovan versus Lewis Crocker 2, really, or even Crawford Canelo, compared to football or whatever. And so if I'm going to be talking about some random Japanese fight that happened in the middle of the night on a Friday, no way. So I'm not a big watcher of these minimum weight fighters. But I do think if you haven't watched Oscar Collazo fight and you're a relatively educated fight fan, I think he's really worth a watch. In that same kind of way that Bam Rodriguez is, in that they're at the lower weights, yes, but the pace of the fight is a way that is somewhat similar to like a lightweight fight. It's not these kind of guys where you're throwing a million punches around and nothing really hurts the other guy. These are fighters that are really, really skilled, yes, but they've also got killer instinct, and you will see those knockouts that you're kind of accustomed to. And for anyone that hasn't seen Oscar Collazo, he reminds me, probably the closest person I can think of really is Lomachenko. I'm not saying he's as good or as any of these fighters, but to me, he's closest to Lomachenko, with a little bit of Usyk and with a little bit of Shakur Stevenson in there. So this is a minimum weight southpaw who is really, really good with the feet. He's very, very smooth. He will throw double jabs and look to kind of pivot round you. He's primarily, I would say, a overwhelming, sort of one of these guys, kind of like Lomachenko, like pressure fighter, but they build momentum. He's not a kind of Mexican type of pressure fighter. He's a kind of overwhelming double jab pivot, left hand to the body, right hook kind of guy. Kind of similar to like Usyk. And the Stevenson analogy is, I see him as sometimes he actually does stay in the pocket and he counters a little bit in the pocket and he kind of comes out and moves in where he's not kind of fully in range, but he's not out of range in that kind of same way Shakur does. And to be frank, I'm a really, really big fan of Oscar Collazo. I think he's got all of the talent in the same way a Chocolatito does, in the same way, maybe not quite as good as a Bam, doesn't quite have that sort of KO artist kind of vibe that a Bam does. But at a minimum weight fighter, you can't really ask for much more than what Collazo gives you. he's kind of got everything, really. That it's very hard to pick holes in his game. The one thing I'd say with Collazo is that he is a little bit hittable. He's not the slickest on the inside, but I think the things that really set him apart are his feet, are his variety of shots, and also his engine. And I'd also say I've seen a handful of his fights, and he's never really one that looks that flustered in the ring. He always seems like he's got everything under control. And he's kind of just building momentum, pivoting off, getting a little bit closer, stepping out, coming in, pivoting around. And I think if you haven't watched him fight, you really, really should. And he's fighting a guy, I think Jayson Vayson. I've only seen clips of one fight he's had. Philippine guy, I think 1 draw, 1 loss, something like 13 wins, I think, 9 KOs, something like that, sort of against kind of nobodies. Sometimes with these kind of Philippine fighters, they come in and they completely shock you, Manny Pacquiao or whatever, and most of the time they don't. And to me, with Vayson, I'm going to call him Vayson, I see that kind of thing. This is a tall, strong, Terminator-ish kind of style. He looks pretty handy from what I've seen. I'm not going to say he's terrible by any means. Pressure fighter, throws punches and bunches, all this kind of stuff. But to me, I think the main problem that he's going to have is Vayson does look like he likes to exchange, and when he does, he looks very, very open. And with Collazo, who is someone who isn't perfect in the pocket, but is pretty damn handy, I just see him getting there first. And Collazo, and with Vayson as well, he's got quite slow feet. He's quite plodding from what I've seen, or at least compared to Collazo. So I see Collazo kind of taking control early and stopping him maybe around sort of, I think round 5, round 6 sounds about right. I don't see this as a particularly close fight, but I've been wrong plenty of times before. But it's been a really good week for boxing. I always really like these kind of fights, like your Lewis Crocker 2 and the Canelo Crawford fights. I like fights with uncertainty in them. I like fights with there's lots of talking points, and I think we've got that. We've got fights that, as boxing fans, we are actually excited to watch. We actually want to tune in for whatever reason. And I think, I've been watching boxing for 10, 12 years now. It's not something that we take as a given all the time. So I think do be thankful that we are getting these fights, and as boxing fans, we've got a pretty good time of it at the minute, because it won't always be like this. But I think that was about it for this week's podcast. For anyone who got this long, I really appreciate the support. I'll be working on another proper video for the channel as soon as I can. I'm going to keep that under wraps for the minute. But any questions or comments, do put them down below. And I look forward to hearing from some of you. And it's all good. I'm out.